This session is about developing employee listening strategy. You're going to hear less from me, even though 65% of people on a recent poll said that they didn't believe that I would be able to shush a little and take my co-host role seriously. So less from me. This is one of our seminar webinars. So this is about actually helping you develop tools that you can use yourself, give you downloads and content, and being able to take that away and use that in your organization, whether you work with us or not, to develop a listening strategy. And I am going to just dial back now, and I'm going to hand over to Jordan, who is our host. Jordan.
Oh, thank you, Nick, and great to see everyone here. So I'm the head of client delivery here at People Experience Hub, and I've also had a number of different jobs in the industry over the years. So I've worked in-house for companies like Asda and Green King, building their listening strategies and running employee engagement initiatives in those organisations, and have built my fair share of listening strategies over the years, both as a consultant and in-house. And one thing that I think it's worth starting with is to really clarify why I think this is an important tool. Like, why do we need an employee listening strategy rather than speaking about just running a specific survey or just thinking about a set of methodologies that you want to use? And I think it sounds a little bit odd, but I think for me, it's about, more than anything, not getting overwhelmed. I remember sitting with, it was someone in a recruitment team I was working with at one point, and she sort of was saying, she asked for my help because she really struggled to understand, well, what about, I struggle with data, I struggle to use data to make points, I used to struggle to be data driven. And so we were chatting it through, and I kind of asked her, well, how do you get better at your job? And she sort of talked about, oh, well, I talk to my stakeholders and I think through and we go through the impact I've had on them. I'm like, well, do you record that information? She's like, well, yeah, I put it in a spreadsheet and just track what people have said to me, and then I can use it in my performance review. And this speaks to the core of it, because that is data. Every conversation that you have, every meeting, every email, yes, every survey, yes, every piece of data that you collect on your people throughout your organization, all of that is data. Some of it's very unstructured, just conversations, anecdotes, general vibes even, are data in their own way. And so once you think about this, hundreds of different points you can take. And even if you think about an employee survey, you can ask hundreds of different questions. Everyone has their own opinions about that. You can ask millions of follow-ups. There's just all of this information. And being able to break that down and think, no, what's important to us? What information do we want to corral and understand about our people? That's where an employee listening strategy is really powerful. It helps you cut through all of that noise to think about, what do we need and want to understand as an organisation? And so what we're kind of going to go through today is a workbook that we're going to be sharing as well after this session, I think during it as well, potentially, but I think definitely after this session to everyone who's interested and who's on this call, is a series of steps on how to develop an employee listening strategy based on our experience here at the People Experience Hub and the things that I've been doing beforehand as well. So yes, you can download the workbook in the link that's just gone into some of the chats, and you can basically play along at home, but I will open my screen as well and share the content that I'll be talking about. So just think here, this is what you'll get when you open the workbook. And really what we're going to do here is we're going to start with some questioning words. And this is always a useful starting point when we think about how to do a lot of things in your organisation, but particularly around employee listening strategies, is to go through an understanding of why, who, what, how and when. Why is all about really understanding why your business exists, what you're looking to do, your strategy for the year, understanding what your business is about, and then how your HR strategies and your cultural enablers feed out from that. Who is a particularly important step, and here is where, and I think some of you may have seen them on my LinkedIn advert for this chat, I'm going to share my #1 trick to help you get a pay rise. We're going to move on to the what then, which is going to be probably the most intimidating slide we'll come to, the biggest activity in this workbook. But if you've done the first 2 steps right, this actually just comes down to putting some text in boxes. And then we're going to take some time at the end to think about how, so the types of methodologies you can use for gathering employee listening. We're not going to go into this in too much detail. This isn't a stats webinar. And then we'll finish with the when. And this is the kind of timelines that you can put around an employee listening strategy, which helps you turn it from this great academic exercise into how am I going to implement this in my own organization? So really what we're going to do is we're going to dive right in and start with the why. Because there's a Simon Sinek quote, isn't it, about starting with why. He's very carefully branded that one around himself, but I think there's a lot of benefit to doing this, which is thinking about the broader strategic context of your organization. Because if you aren't aligned with where your organization is going, with your people strategy, your business strategy, it can be easy to come unstuck. You can suddenly create a lot of outputs, create some brilliant surveys with fantastic questions that don't seem to go anywhere because they aren't integrating with what your business wants. And you can create what I call a lot of nice to knows, where everyone goes, oh yes, that's very interesting. And then you actually don't see things change within your organization. So I think this is a really crucial step to not skip past. And one thing that I'll often use with people in organizations when we're thinking about this is, how does your company make money? At the very core of it, if you can clearly and concisely articulate, we make money by doing X, Y, and Z. We make money by selling a great survey platform and wonderful consultancy and support around it, for example. That helps you to think about the goals of your organization. Okay, so how is the business trying to do those things, trying to achieve those things? The second thing you could then start to consider once you think about the goals for the next maybe year, 2 years for your organization is what cultural enablers will facilitate that in terms of what aspects of employees' perceptions, what skills, what thoughts you want your employees to have that will help you to deliver those goals. And linked to this is a concept of risk. What risks are there to the business strategy being a success? Are there any things that could get in the way of your employees' experiences that will then impact your business as a whole? And I think here's a great point, Nick, actually, I'm going to pull on you here, is when you spend a lot of your time talking with like HR directors, people, CEOs, is there anything in particular for you that people have been talking about as maybe a risk or as a particular goal for people over the next year?
I think at the moment, we're running our State of the People Professions survey at the moment, and we've got a lot of organizational data, and I think we've got like something around 160 organizations have added a voice to that. And what we're seeing from that at this high level, I guess, organizational concerns for the future are probably unsurprising. So cost of living crisis, legal changes that are coming, labour and skill shortages, economic downturn or economic volatility, and technological changes are on the agenda for everyone in terms of a concern for the future. So that focus for the future.
I think there's some really great points there.
I'm going to lead you down a path and ask you how you think.
Sorry, I think someone's there's just someone just gone on mute now. Sorry for the noise on the call there, everyone. Some great thoughts there, and I think I'm going to pick out a couple of elements here because I think they could fit into some of these boxes quite well. One of the things is around the cost of living crisis. So we talk about this as a major challenge for employees, but it's also something which is going to affect how businesses are thinking and how they're pivoting and responding to the external environment. Like, think about them. Deloitte have a CFO survey that they run a lot of the time, and this looks at risk appetite, whether chief financial officers are willing to spend money or not. And the harder the economic landscape quite often finds that there's less money to go around within businesses as well. Maybe organizations are turning to consider things like automation, about thinking about efficiency, or, as you say, Nick, linked to that, about technology. How do we better utilize the technologies that are out there, especially the big conversations happening about artificial intelligence right now? They're great things to understand when you're filling in this activity, because you can start to think, well, what are the key risks here? What are the key people that need to be thought about when we are building our why, building our employee listening strategy? What are the key HR priorities we have as a business? If adapting to new technology is part of your business's journey over the next 2 years, and I think for most people on the call, it's going to feature into that, that technology is going to require cultural changes. People need to become more open to interacting with technology in different ways. They need to be curious about the technologies that they're bringing in. They need to think differently about how they interact with other teams, or whether they're actually interacting with agentic AI as well. These are great things to start to think about when you're filling in this slide. And the bottom point we have on this slide is important here, which is you might not have all the answers. When you're thinking through this activity, you might find that you've got some blind spots where you actually couldn't articulate what your people priorities are for the next year, or what might change in the employee experience over the next 12 months. That's the point for you to stop, put down the pen, and go and have those conversations. Think about the impacts that those conversations can have on your strategy, but also on your presence within your organization too. If you're taking the time to work with your senior, say, HR leaders or business leaders across the broader organization, you're also raising your profile too. And that kind of brings me to the next section. And I promised I wasn't going to get too Machiavellian with this, but there may be moments where I go that way, so apologies. But we're going to talk about the who. This is probably my favorite slide in this workbook and the best activity. And it comes in two parts. The first one is more about your organization as a whole. So the key populations, when we think about our strategy, when we think about our HR priorities, that we need to consider as really important populations to listen to. Maybe it's a group that has a major challenge. So something like you work in a hospitality firm and you're worried that the back of house experience isn't great because you can't keep hold of chefs, and chefs are moving on to different jobs with much higher pay scales, and it's really difficult to keep staff. Or maybe you're working in a sort of a services company, and you're thinking about the changes that things like AI and data are going to bring to your organization over the coming years. Well, the employee experience of your cybersecurity team and your IT team are really important to consider, because actually if they are really disengaged, if they aren't connected into doing a great job, if they are not that motivated, what do you think that's going to do to your risk profile when you think about new age threats in the technology space? So there's key populations when you think about your strategy that are going to come to the fore quite naturally, that you might want to understand in a more detailed way, that you might want to be listening to as a top priority. But the second part of this exercise is about influencers. Who in your organization has interest in what you do, so knows you exist, really wants your data, but also who has influence in your organization, who can help you to make your findings a reality. And it's like one thing I find that can be quite frustrating for people who do employee listening or who are maybe people analytics professionals, is that they do these great projects, they answer these great questions, they build these great slide decks, and then they don't feel like they're having a great impact on the organization. Where maybe they'll struggle even to get time in people's diaries to show them their findings, or they might feel like their findings aren't being used in a way they hoped they would be. And this can sometimes reflect the fact that at the core of it, businesses aren't just strategies on a page. They're made up of people, messy organizations of people with their own biases and emotions and politics. And there is an element of always having to navigate that when you are looking to implement any kind of strategy or any kind of listening, because trying to create influence and change off the back of the things that you find is about influence. It is about interacting with the people who can make change happen. I'm drawing you here, Nick, actually, and got your hand up, and it's a nice stopping point. I'd love to hear your views there. It'd be better if you came off mute.
There we go. Schoolboy error. I'm looking at multiple channels as well, and interesting to see some general comments and stuff. What I really like about this approach around how interested somebody in, or what level of interest they have in the work that is happening, their level of influence on that work, or anything that you need to do around that is really interesting, because this takes away from a hierarchical approach, which often happens, which is you know, the highest paid person in the room or the highest paid loudest person in the room actually could be in that bottom left box. They're not actually going to influence much of the project we're doing right now, and they're not actually that interested. So it's keep them up to date and keep them communicated. So I think one of the questions that's come in is around if this transcends that hierarchy, like what happens when you have ego?
And when you say that, like when you're dealing with big egos,
yeah,
in
I
your
want to know.
Yeah,
I don't like the fact that you just put me in the bottom left box.
So one of the things I wouldn't generally share where people are on this, but it's useful as a tool for you to understand when you're building out your strategies, to think about who you're going to have to work with and influence. It's not that these people who might be low influence on the people experience are low influence in your organization as a whole. It's just for your purposes as well. And it's also important to think about some of your high interest people, because often at times, like, we think about high interest people as, oh, they're on the bus, they're really involved, they want us to give them great insights. But these high interest people have their own agendas too. And actually, they might want you to run surveys to give them the answers that they want. I was once working in an organization, and it was the learning and development person I was working with, and she'd be very happy with me telling this story because she actually told it in training sessions afterwards as well. We were talking about using employee listening to evaluate training that she was running, and she's like, and I said, well, and if the results show that the training was a success, and she starts about, Jordan, no, the results have to show that the training was a success. And it's like, I get that, but that's not how the listening works. There is a piece here which is, you are going to be an impartial party to a lot of your organization through doing employee listening. You kind of have to be that blank slate to understand what people across your organization are saying, the different groups and their different opinions. You gather it through a survey or an interview or a focus group. You're going to have to reflect their views into the organization. And so you're going to have to take all of those egos as well, funnel them through, and help people to see the impacts of what they're doing and the perceptions of them from the whole organization. One thing that can often be the case is you're talking to leadership teams about what their people think of them. Leadership team questions on surveys, for example. These are often high interest, high influence people who you need to keep on the bus, but you're also going to be delivering some difficult feedback. So there's an element here of thinking about your own skill set when you're dealing with those egos. How are you at influencing people? How are you at engaging people in wanting to change their behaviors? And whilst you might not have got into this kind of employee listening or HR or people analytics space to think about influencing senior execs, there is going to be a part of your job which is going to involve that. I talked about that quite a bit, Nick. Did that kind of get to the answer?
No, I think it absolutely did. And kind of my own moment of a little bit of joy here was around, actually, how many times have I gone into a business or worked in a business where we're building out that core team, we're building out the who needs to be in this team to help us deliver the best outcome for this, the high interest, high influence team. And I can actually, I mean, I have loads of stories that I'm not going to go into because I'm not going to talk loads, but where we haven't got the right people in that core team. Those people have felt out of the core team, but they know their influence is high or their interest is high. And actually, what this is a really great tool that people in IT that you may think of as a support team suddenly become the core team. People in cybersecurity, they may come into the core team at an early stage and come out of the core team later on. And I guess there's this could, just to make it even more complicated for you, this could transition over time into the launch team, the delivery team, the action team. You know,
definitely. And one thing you probably want to do when you do this exercise in the first place is you'll talk about, well, where is, I don't know, a HR director on this graph? And they might not be in the box you want them to be in. And so one of the key things you want to consider, and I'll come on to this on the next slide as well, is how do we make them more of an advocate? How do we build their awareness, for example? How do we get them involved in telling us what they want to know? Because when you get that understanding from people, those people in high interest and high influence boxes, you get the understanding of what they want to know, you can weave that into the listening that you do. And that's where you can start to really build that positive cycle. And don't get me wrong, some of the high interest people can also be really annoying. If you have your listening strategy, you're like, I want to know about these 10 things because they're going to be really impactful in our company strategy and we're going to help transform the business. And then you have this group of people who love what you do coming to you saying, oh, can you also run this survey? Oh, can you also talk to these people? Oh, can we run a focus group and an interview? These people are important to keep on side to help build your use cases, to build your profile in the organization as a whole, but you are always going to have to balance their needs against some of the other people that you're trying to, especially high influence people, that you're trying to accommodate to. And I hope that when I've been talking through some of these examples, you're kind of thinking to yourself as well, oh, that maybe our CEO fits in one of these boxes, or maybe our HR director fits in one of these boxes. And I want you to take a moment and think, is that where you want them to sit? Or do you want to talk to them, understand what they want to know, so you can build that into your listening strategy in the next stage? So I'll come to you, Nick, actually now. Have you got any other thoughts, any other questions come into the chat before we move on to kind of going from this theoretical world into some of the hard graft of what we need to listen, what we need to find out?
I think more of a comment, really, that being action orientated at the end of a listening strategy, at the end of something, is something people are aware of, and most people will talk about how they need to do that better, or they need to do more of it, and they need to be focused on it. What I think I see here is, what I really like is when you're at the start of your listening strategy, what you're starting to see is an action orientated approach, which is the actions to communicate, the actions to build awareness, the action to build advocacy, that you start with almost intent. And that intent, I think when you get momentum, I think what I'm trying to say is when you get momentum, and that momentum is to be action orientated, when you start with that, it will flow through the whole process, and people do get on the bus then.
Yeah. And I think what's really important about all of this is that employee listening is not just about, let's gather people's views so we can report about it in our annual reports, or we can feel good about listening to our employees. Like, the whole purpose of doing this is to make change happen. And whether that's influencing your manager populations, who usually will sit in multiple of these boxes, you'll have some managers who really get it, others who you need to convert. But it might be you want to influence your manager populations to take action off the back of a big annual survey. Or you might want to be thinking about, how do I embed employee listening into our corporate planning cycle? So, okay, they're building a plan for 2026. How do we make sure employee listening is happening that gives them the right information to do that planning, so we can help create those changes as well? If you just create great slide decks and nothing happens with it, there's always going to be an element of maybe you didn't touch into what your stakeholders really wanted to know. Or you didn't shock your stakeholders with a scary enough number. That's also quite a useful tactic. But I did say I wasn't going to get too Machiavellian, so I'm going to move on before I start talking about how to win friends and influence people. So you've gone through these two stages. You're thinking first on the previous slide here about your why, about the goals of the organization, the risks and the strategic priorities. You've then brought in the human element. Who do we want to understand better? And what are the key people in our network wanting to understand? The next thing you kind of need to do is just build a list. Take the things from that why. What are the strategic goals you want to understand? What are the risk enablers? And write them down in these boxes. And I think in the PDF that we're sharing, the workbook, if you've downloaded it already, these are going to be editable boxes as well. So here, for example, take the strategic dimension, capability enabler, or risk. Basically, something from your first exercise. So here it could be technology adaptiveness. People need to be resilient to the change that technology brings. Great, that's a wonderful what to have on this slide. Maybe it's something like employees' comfort with their financial situation because we're in the cost of living crisis. Maybe that's our employees' ability to be productive with the resources that they're given. Maybe it's about engagement. Maybe you want to understand employee engagement as an outcome because that's a key strategic enabler for you. Or with quite a lot of organizations I'm talking to at the minute, it may be that you want to understand client centricity. So actually, are people willing to really drive change in your organization on behalf of your clients? Or is it that they're just instead working to just do their job and stay in their box? These are all key enablers for different strategies that your organization might have. And I think they're really powerful things to pull into this slide. You had a really profound look on your face then, Nick, with an intake of breath. Were you going to jump in?
Well, it was interesting because I'm jumping around so many different things. Like,
that's great.
And I keep jumping back into the State of the People Profession survey to see what HR people are talking about. And I wanted to kind of look at capability, enablers, and risks. And we looked at the skills stuff. So, like, just even looking at this, talking about things like understanding and working with technology being an important skill, understanding working with AI being almost that next step level that says we've obviously got a population of people that say, in terms of our what, is it capability, is it an enabler, is it a risk, and someone's going to have to make that call on that. But I really like, in terms of that strategic dimension stuff, and loading this up with ending up with this list of what are we looking to do, what's going to get in the way of us doing it, what is going to enable us to do this, and what's a threat to us doing this. And you start that's where you start really pulling in that skills dimension of skill, the dimension of organization priorities, the dimension of the goals we have in front of us. We'll don't want to focus on hospitality too much, but head chef retention is a risk to our strategic priority of driving profitability in our food-led establishments. And it's, but it could also be marketing outreach is a strategic dimension in our growth of revenue and brand awareness. So this doesn't have to be about everything employee engagement. This is about the organization. And again, sorry, the one thing I'm going to build into this is you want to get your C-suite on board. You want to get your CFO, your CEO, your CPO, whoever it is. You want to get your C-suite and your leaders on board. Make it relevant to them.
Completely. And you can see on the side here that some of the boxes just say stakeholder interest topic. The number of questions that I've snuck into a survey on the back of talking to a CEO where they've read an article about something they're really interested in, and that's changed their thinking about something. It's like, oh, well, I want to understand about feelings of joy in the workplace, as a random example. Take that feedback. Your CEO's interested in something in the people dimension. You might not think joy is something that you really need to be measuring on your survey or measuring in your employee listening strategy. But it's going to go a long way if you can build a good question or some good research around that, because otherwise your CEO will probably go off and try and do something themselves, knowing most CEOs that I've worked with and talked with. And no reflection on you there, Nick. But no, it's useful to have this balance. And the reason that we do the exercise in this way is to do exactly that, Nick, is to pull it away from just thinking about the core employee experience and instead to think about the strategic part of your organization and turn this from just a HRBP decision tool or a HRD decision tool into a full C-suite decision tool. How are you giving them the information they need to have those difficult conversations about people in the business and the culture of the business? One thing, though, that you might find when you get to this point in the exercise is, yeah, you've got some great strategic pieces, but you kind of need to just check if you're missing something. And this is where I think the second half of this slide comes in. These are the three kind of lenses, and Nick talks about this right at the beginning, of how we talk about the employee experience. So perceived environment, which is like day-to-day experience, the sort of what do employees think about their day-to-day. Felt experience, which is a more emotional connection, what do employees feel, and then different people outcomes that you might want to be measuring so you understand where your employees are on these different things. Are employees willing to advocate for you? Are they thinking about trying to create new innovations? Are they customer centric? Obviously, very difficult to ask about customer centricity sometimes because it always can sound a bit like, are you a good employee? So there's some clever question design you generally have to do there, but it is definitely possible. But thinking about these topics on the right gives you this holistic view of the employee experience, all the different things that might come into it. So then you can compare that and see, have we missed something? Do we actually need to ask more questions about learning and development? Because it is on the people strategy, but we've missed it so far in this exercise. Do we actually ask a question about, do we have a question about autonomy that we want to answer in our organization? Is it that we want people to be trying to drive change on behalf of customers? That's a key thing about autonomy and customer centricity. And that might not have been something you considered so far. So this is kind of a check and a balance for you. And the whole point of this overall activity for the Your What slide here is to think about all of the different ingredients, all of the different things that you want to understand about your people. Because that is then what's going to lead us on to the next piece when we think about, okay, well, how do we measure this? How do we gather that information? I'll just stop here for a sec, Nick, if you've got any questions, any other thoughts before we move on to the next slide.
I think the main thing is though, probably to draw people's attention to the people outcomes on the right here. And I think what interests me, we're talking about employee listening and we're looking for people outcomes that support organizational goals and their goals for their people, their desires for their people. And I think that what's interesting to me is this isn't just about employee engagement. Yeah. And I'm going to circle just back on you asked me about some stuff around what are people talking about right now when I'm out talking with people in the world. One of the things I'm hearing quite a lot of is, tell me things that will impact me and my teams and my business. When you talk about nebulous concepts, I understand it. I understand the concept, but I can't take that and communicate that to 4,000 people. Yeah. Everyone's version of employee engagement is different, but when we talk about innovation, we want our people to be innovative. We may have to describe what innovation means in our organizational frame, but it's known. Customer centricity, I really love customer centricity. And I think actually the three things that I'm hearing about from people outcomes are customer centricity, change readiness, and the employee engagement standards. Yeah. And I think those are actually the three things that probably tell us a little bit about 2024, probably a lot about 2025, that C-suite are focusing on engagement outcomes, customer outcomes, and change readiness outcomes.
No, that's really great, Nick. Yeah, I think it's a great call out there, and that's the big thing, is just engagement is important, but thinking about the other things you could be also asking about and understanding from your people. And so now you've got your big list of what you want to measure. You can move on to understand, well, how could we measure those things? And the way I tend to do it is I'll take that big list and start to put them into different boxes. So the different methodologies you can use. And so here are just some of the core ones you might want to consider. In the next slide here, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but it is going to be in your workbooks, is a big list of the pros and cons of each of the different kinds of listening you can do. But I'm just going to touch on these kind of core elements on this slide. So the first one is around an annual or major survey. This is big employee survey, lots of questions, usually some free text, lots of scale responses. And it can have been seen as a bit of an uncool thing to do for the last few years. And we talked about this on our last webinar as well. But there's a piece here around, it's a super efficient way of gathering a large amount of information across your whole organization. Because the perfect understanding would be if you had an organization of 10 people and you could have an in-depth conversation with every single one of them. But as soon as you've got an organization of 10,000, you need a way of doing that efficiently. And an annual survey is an excellent way of doing that. It also helps you do much more statistical analysis, being able to say, what are the elements of the perceived environment? So things like managers, learning and development, people practices, organizational effectiveness, that drive the outcomes we want, those things like innovation, those things like change readiness. And an annual survey is a great tool for doing that kind of thing. And the reason this box is quite big is it can also be an efficient bucket for gathering a lot of information. So when you have maybe 30 things on that previous slide, a lot of them are going to be able to be met through doing something like a big annual survey. And we can go through this whole employee listening journey, and sadly for some of you, you will come out of it and be like, oh, we just need to run an employee survey once a year. But it's totally fine that that's where you come out of it. The point of going through this exercise is to think differently about then the questions that you ask in that survey, to link into your organizational strategy and to link in with what your stakeholders are wanting to know. But there are many cases where an annual survey isn't what you want to do. Maybe it's part of the employee life cycle that's going wrong. Maybe you want to really understand, why are we losing people, say, in the first 90 days of them joining us? Or why do people return from mat leave but then leave the organization soon after? Are we not creating a good experience for returning mothers? Maybe it's that you return from people who've returned from sick, or maybe it's when a manager moves teams, you're having real problems with new teams getting new managers in your organization. These are all parts of the employee life cycle that you can instead target with, say, automated triggered surveys like the moment surveys we talked about in our previous webinar, and I'm sure we'll be linking in the chat at some point or after this call, sending out more information on that too. Pulse surveys are also a way of gathering information, but they're more targeted, not around life cycle elements, but instead around specific teams. So, for example, earlier I mentioned the cybersecurity team, for example. It could be that there's some stuff you really want to understand from that part of your business. Maybe even you want to gather an anonymous understanding from each of your members of your IT team on what are the biggest risks you think there are for our IT systems in our organization. That could be a super insightful short survey that you sent out to that team within your business to understand, actually, what are the problems? Do they talk about hardware? Do they talk about software? Or do they talk about the users in your organization being the major risks? You're probably going to get a blend of those, but you might get some things that don't sit within your current IT strategy or your framework and introduce new risks you might not have considered. So there's lots of specific use cases where, if something from your previous slides, this big what list, is about sort of a specific group, or it's about a specific point in time, maybe it's about people who've gone on a specific training course even, and we want to understand how good that training course has been at, say, preparing leaders to have difficult conversations, being very targeted with pulse surveys can yield some great results in measuring some of those what's from the list. But it can be easy for us to just get caught in talking about surveys. We are a company that has a survey platform technology, and so we're often going to talk about how useful they are, and there's going to be lots of companies out there talking about how useful surveys are because they have survey platforms. But there is an element of this where conversations are data. Qualitative research produces incredible data. Sitting down and talking with people can get you a lot more of the why, in terms of, why do people think certain things? What are people meaning when they talk about something on a survey? Maybe it's something that's really sensitive, that you want, like a DE&I issue, for example, within your organization, that a survey might not be the best format for. Maybe it's that there's only 2 people in your whole company that have an experience that you really care about understanding. Interviews are probably going to be the way you go with that. And then the last piece on this table that I think can often get missed is that you already have feedback mechanisms inside your organization that aren't sitting within an employee survey or within a focus group or something you're running as part of traditional employee listening. You might have employee resource groups like an ethnicity network or an LGBTQ network. You might have union presence in your organization and consultative bodies. I once worked with, in one of my first jobs, an incredible industrial relations exec, and she would talk about, like, the importance of a collaborative relationship with union bodies. And actually they provide a great system of letting you know when things are going wrong in your organization that you might not get elsewhere. They're also part of employee listening. And actually, the town hall your CEO does, where people ask questions, actually, if you record the kinds of questions that people are asking in those, you might be able to look at interesting trends, look at interesting developments over time on what employees really care about, or at least feel bold enough to ask the CEO about. And those are both two very interesting points of data. So there's lots of ways you can capture information on the things that you've outlined on this previous slide So you can think about being a bit creative with how you actually measure them. This is something I could talk about until the cows come home, so I'm going to kind of cut myself off here, and Nick's hand's gone up as well to try and cut me off too. But this is something that if anyone is really interested in, oh, I have this really thorny challenge, how do I measure, how do I measure something really weird? Please do drop me a message, because it's the sort of chat I love to have, because I'm a big nerd. So Nick, I'm going to pass over to you in case you got your hand up.
I think that I'll come back. Andy in the chat has left some interesting points. We'll come back to those in a second. And I think one of the realizations I've had about this, and it's my learning style is I like to see, I like to be immersed, and then I think about use cases probably on the journey. And I knew the use case for this up front around setting that strategy. But I'm now starting to think about micro strategies or micro tactical solutions in terms of delivering that overall listening strategy, because events happen, right? And I'm thinking about some work that we've done on an organization going through merger and acquisition work, where, actually the interviews with, here's an organization that we're about to acquire. We want to understand their culture. We want to understand what it's like to work in that business, but we can't, due to sensitivities, go and run a large survey. We can't do large focus groups. So what we're going to do is interview some key people that are aware of what's going on. And what we're going to do is a culture assessment and interview them. And that's micro in as much as you didn't expect that to come along and you now have to build it in. And what I think what I'm seeing here is a tool that enables you to just dial it back up, dial back into this. Right, a new thing has come along. An M&A, mergers and acquisition activity has just been declared. We need to think about communication, integration of two different cultures, and I don't have any information apart from maybe I've got Glassdoor on the company we're acquiring, but outside of that, I have no further information. So starting to build in the how into how are you going to solve that. Today, I'd like to do some interviews. I'm going to take out some information in the public domain. I'm going to take some Glassdoor information out. That's how I'm going to start listening to their culture. Any information that is available to me freely. But my journey is I will run some moment surveys. So when the announcement happens on both sides, we'll run a moment survey. How was that announcement? How did you feel about this? How do you feel about this? What support do you think you need? And you can just weave almost this into a micro in the macro. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think for me, and you'll know this already, Nick, having joined here, but anyone who's ever worked with me before knows I love a living document. So don't do just something once and let it gather dust. Make something part of your ongoing conversations. Keep reviewing this kind of workbook and thinking, is there something new that's emerging? Some new event that means we need to reconsider what's most important to us? Has this knocked something off the list of importance? Or is this just another thing on top? How do we slot that into the listening we already have? Or like you say, if it's something that like an M&A activity, that's a huge event often for an organization. How do we target specific listening interventions to understand how people are feeling during that journey? I absolutely love that.
And Andy's comment on, so Andy said it's about balance, which is temptation to gather more and more and more and more information, get out there and listen more and more and more and more. And he's saying the relevance of channels, your point around the relevance of channels, being mindful of fatigue of the process and an advocate of continuous conversations with landmark surveys. And he's made a point, which is if people really do see meaningful responses and action from their comments, then they'll see the worth in these conversations. And I'm thinking back a slide now, which is risks and enablers, capability enablers and risks, key population needs. And when we think about like employees in this, so going to Andy's point, what we've almost done live is to say an employee's need is to see that when they do give you feedback or they do participate in a voice exercise, I guess I'm using that because if it's listening from the organization side, it's voice from the participant side. So if they take part in a voice activity where they're giving you their voice and their opinion, then the need is to see action. And then that
Yeah.
dials up into enabler risk capability. Are we able to take action? Are we able to deliver to this? So this, yeah, this is really good. It's really coming to life for me, actually. For somebody who's already seen this document and talked to you, just presenting this and having this feedback is really helping.
Oh, I'm glad. And I think one thing I can often think about is, and I was talking about this with my team when I was back in Green King, was how do we think like political analysts? How do we think like pollsters? Because really the employees who work in an organisation, they are a constituency. You want to understand what they're thinking and feeling. And actually, if the company experience is getting better on average over time, people are going to keep being happy to give their views, even if one specific aspect that they talked about on a survey wasn't particularly met. Like, employees aren't silly. They understand that there's priorities, they understand what business is like. But if the vibe is getting better, people are going to keep wanting to be involved. But if the experience of working in an organization is getting further and further out of step with what employees want, then that's going to swing you in the other direction. And I think that's often where fatigue comes from as well. It's not just thinking about an action cycle, which can be great and is a wonderful way of keeping people involved. But actually, there is a broader cycle to that, which is, are we in a general improvement cycle for employees' experiences, or are we going in the wrong direction and creating that gulf between what an employee is wanting, because they are a key population, what employees want and what the organisation is providing to them?
And I think, and I won't take too much time because I'm aware we've got 15 minutes and
we're closing in on the end, Nick, don't worry.
Okay, so just on this slide, the one after the how, it's, again, I think the interesting thing of this is understand if you're part of the project group, the core project group, if you are looking at what tools are in the toolbox, understanding the pros and cons, and the pros and cons in your environment may be different to these as well. I think as well, this helps people see past things like marketing spin or I thought I was buying. It really gets into the whole limitations of any type of tool. So where does one tool have a limitation, a con, that another tool complements it really well? And I think that's got to be part of that listening strategy, saying we're going to do an annual survey and we recognize that pulse survey providers maybe would say they're not great, but why are they great and what are the limitations? But pulse surveys are great at this and are not so great at it. So use the right tool for the right job, and all of a sudden we're building a listening toolbox rather than going at it with one trendy thing or the one thing I could do.
And like for me as well, there's context around your audiences here that we haven't gone into as much detail on. But if your audience that you want to understand doesn't fill in surveys, looking at both senior leader populations and people like store managers, both can be difficult populations to get to fill in ad hoc surveys. Don't try and keep sending them surveys. Like, surveys might be a great tool for what you want to measure, but it's not a great tool if no one fills them in. So actually, 10 conversations, literally, if you are in a store seeing a store manager, or even talk to some area managers about what their store managers are saying to them, that can be way more powerful data because it's real and gathered and it exists, compared to sending a survey that maybe 3 store managers who already love you respond to, because that's actually not going to give you the same richness and understanding. So these tools are great for their different uses, but in your organization, you're going to have different relationships with some of these. Because I remember working with a university client one time, and they talked about just this massive employee survey that they used to send out like once a year to every single person who works at the university. And this survey was so long that it gave annual surveys such a bad name within the organization that you had to find other ways of listening because no one wanted to fill in a big survey anymore. And then you could build the trust up over time about listening, but that was like survey fatigue from one survey. So again, it's think about the context of methods within your company or your organization as well. And for example, if you have a culture where people don't feel comfortable or safe speaking up, something like focus groups or interviews might be quite hard. External facilitation can help with some of that, but there's other elements where people just won't feel comfortable speaking up unless it's 100% anonymous. No one could ever work out who they are. And again, that's why something like an annual survey can become useful. So there's like an extra layer to think about your own context as well on this slide. But I'm not going to go into these in detail because I think really, Nick, you've given a good intro there, and I don't want to bore people with a lecture on when is a staff survey better than a life cycle survey or a pulse survey. It's all here in the workbook. Instead, I want to kind of finish us off with something about turning this more into reality. So when you have thought through employee listening strategy, you've got the tools you want to use. How do you tell that story to your manager? How do you tell that story to the HR directors and the HR leadership team? How do you tell that story to the organization? And actually, more often than not, a timeline is the best way to do this. We're going to launch a big survey here. We're going to have some little surveys maybe here and here, or one for new joiners, one for leavers. And we're going to run some focus groups around this change in the organization and after our main survey to get some more information. That could be all you do. That could be the main, you go through all of this work from this document and you come out of it, and what most people see off the back of it is a timeline. But you and your team, you have the understanding of this timeline is our activity, and then all of the content that we've talked about drops into one of these little buckets, into the annual survey, into the pulse. And the one thing to think about when you're building your timeline is not just when do you want to do things. So annual surveys are a great example here. We want to run an annual survey in September. Why? Because it's after summer holidays, but before Christmas. So we can run it for 3 weeks, we can get the results out, and managers can action plan at the end of November before people start leaving for Christmas holidays. It's why survey companies are busy in September, November time, because lots of people want to go live in that window. Problem is, for many organizations, strategic planning cycles run from October to December, where actually we're planning for the next big year of activity for our organization, and we will have a plan locked down by the end of December. Your employee survey results might not get into that planning cycle early enough if you're running your survey in September. And so actually, maybe a little bit of a response rate hit by going live in the summer gets you on the right timeline to feed into that strategic planning cycle. So it's important to think about some of the things, your key populations, the who's from that previous slide. When's the best time to influence them? Because that might be where is best to slot in some of your big pieces of listening, like your annual survey. And so what we've kind of gone through here today is we've gone from this kind of beginning with this sort of piece around your organizational strategy, your people goals, the cultural enablers that feed into that, understanding who you want to influence and who you want to understand, building your big list of then what you want to get. You group that based on the tools that are best to use to gather that information. And then out of that, you come to a timeline where you can tell that story to your organization and talk about how you're going to listen to people throughout the year. And this kind of activity can be really, I think, is really helpful. And I hope you find when you work through the workbooks yourself as well, that's going to be the case. And I think want to touch on this slide to finish, like this can be very involved work. If you do it right, there's a lot of conversations to have, a lot of stakeholders to get on board, a lot of people to talk to. You might need to get the strategy signed off. But it's also worth thinking about at this point, who do you need to get that buy-in from? Who do you need to get involved in this journey before the sign-offs start to come in? Who do you want to get on the bus now, be part of that core team before you take this and shop this around your organization as a whole? Because this is the start of the journey, but I hope it's one that this start gives you a great springboard to have these really in-depth, powerful conversations in your organization. So at the end of the workbook, there's some little, there's a QR code for booking a demo, and also things around our organization as a whole. So our 5-minute platform walkthrough, PX Hub in 2 minutes, which I think is great too. I'm going to stop sharing what's in the workbook now and kind of open up for any questions and any final thoughts. And I'll come to you first, Nick.
So Andy has asked a question actually, which is, would you include one-to-ones in your listening strategy? And what's the best way to capture themes that might emerge from those, which could then be fed into a wider listening strategy?
So yes, 100% you want to think about them as a tool. One-to-ones are always a bit challenging because they have to serve multiple purposes. Like they're often about the individual who's in that one-to-one with their manager. And so oftentimes that conversation should be being dictated by that individual. And it's hard to come to that meeting with a script. But what I find really powerful is that those managers essentially have been running a bunch of interviews for you. And so if you have specific things you want to understand about groups in your organization, tapping into those manager networks can help you get your finger on the pulse of what's going on, maybe even interview them and gather their thoughts, and that gives you some good data. Gathering lots of information off the back of one-to-ones can be really hard to structure if you're doing it across a whole business, and it might be better to think about something more efficient like an annual survey if you start having to do that on a regular basis.
Great, thank you. And I guess there's an element to this, which is a lot of what we've just been talking about sounds quite high level. You know, anytime you put the word strategy in something, it feels instantly elevates it up to something that's a bit deeper. If you can only do one thing in your organization, if you can only have budget to do one bit of technology for listening or one non-technology listening, this tool will help you think about that, yes?
Completely. And for me, it always comes down to, like, when I talk about what's most efficient in your organization, that is down also to your time and your money. So like you can use 6 tools if you want, but if you don't have the budget to do it or the time to analyze all those results, you're actually not going to drive as much activity as you would do from maybe a couple of even focus groups. So some small organizations that I've talked to start off their journey thinking they need a survey and work through something like this and come out of the other side being like, actually, we need to run some town hall meetings. And that's actually the employee listening that we really need to tap into on this part of our growth journey until we have enough employees to make it worth doing other listening activity. But other small organizations might go into it and come out going, oh, we need to understand a bunch of important strategy stuff that we can't get anywhere else than a big survey. So even if we're a small company, we want to start going live with this now because we're at that stage of what we want to understand. So definitely this kind of exercise will help you prioritize the right tools for the job.
And I think as well, again, when thinking about somebody who's resource poor, but there's a challenge, isn't there, which is we want everyone in our organization to have a voice of some kind, a voice. We want our people to be able to raise that voice, whether that's through compliance, through whistleblowing, through something like that, or whether it is through organizational change, employee engagement, wherever that lens is pointing, we want our people to have a voice. And I guess my summary of this is if you want your people to have a voice, you can't just throw some kind of tool that gives them a voice or a perceived voice. If you don't do something,
don't just grab a template. This can be often what can be very challenging is just, here's a template that's just off the shelf. This consultancy's told us these are the questions we need to ask.
Yeah, and that's where then suddenly the word strategy comes in. So not highfalutin, accessible to anyone. A listening strategy to give your people a voice is an ethical standpoint and a strategic standpoint, and is good for the business and good for its people. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you everyone for joining the call. It's been great to share this with you, and I think both mine and Nick's inboxes are always open, and we will chat about this till the cows come home. So do book in some time with us.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. We will share the workbook out to people. We'll make it available on our website as well. We'll have a recording from this webinar that we'll share as part of that workbook. And our lovely Director of People Science, Chief Operating Officer, Rob Robson, has written a blog to accompany this as well. So we will share that as well. So there's a lot of lovely free content out there to get people going on listening strategies. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. Thank you, Jordan, and goodbye.